Okay, hello. It's that time again. Got the Jank Diver Gaming Modern Horizons 3 set update coming in for our Peasant Cube. I'm not going to waste too much time on this one with gags or memes or anything. There are so many cards to get through. I'm terrified of how long this video is going to take me to get through and end up being. That being said, there is one thing that seems to be missing from this set. So, Watsy, I would like to request more hats, please. There was a distinct lack of it in this set, and that will not stand. All right. So, as usual, we'll start off with white. We're going to be swapping Citizen's Crowbar for Witch Enchanter. I'm not making that joke a third time. Crowbar is a totally fine card. Supports our tokens themes a little bit with very minor token synergy, has some very minor other upsides throughout the cube. That being said, Witch Enchanter was a pretty obvious include for us. We like being able to slap this onto a land where you'll be able to build it right into your mana base. So we're just going to go ahead and make this swap. And we had 70 cards or so to swap in. And so while there are cards in this cube that have performed totally fine, something has to go to fit these up. In what is going to be a very quick discussion here, Airy Auxiliary is coming in over Angelic Quartermaster. As we mentioned in our Peasant Cube review episode, this is just the same card, but a full mana cheaper. Call It Surprise Witness is coming out for Dog Umbra. Not 100% sure that Dog Umbra is going to end up being super good, but it looks like the kind of card that we are excited to at least try out. Call It Surprise Witness is a effect that we actually have quite a density of overall, especially in black. I mentioned in the last update that we're getting a little glutted on this, so we're going to make this swap for the Modal Protection / Pacifism spell and see how it plays out in this environment. Swapping Dauntless Bodyguard for Indebted Spirit. Bodyguard's been here for a very long time, so he is finally taking one for the team and swapping out for the Indebted Spirit, which is just a strict upgrade over Doom Traveler. We don't have a ton of specific synergies for this card. I'm not sure exactly what its use case is going to be, though I could see it being good in any of our white pairs outside maybe blue-white. And even there, as just a cheap roadblock card that provides you with a couple of speed bumps, you could view it as something like 1 mana gains 6 or 7 life, and that could be okay. Mentor of the Meek unfortunately came to the client a little later than would have made it good. It's the kind of card that can be very, very powerful, but Modern Magic is so fast, and the fact that you have to pump mana in this after you spend 3 mana for an undersized creature just didn't really work. We think Proud Pack Rhino is going to be an obviously good card with better overall stats and a powerful ETB ability. Most of the time you're going to put a shield counter on something, likely the Rhino itself, though you could use it to do something obnoxious like protect a Rosy Cotton. The Proliferate will occasionally come up if you play this after a Ridgescale Tusker or something like that to really buff your team up, or if you're playing it in the Roots deck to be able to pump up all the plant tokens that you make. But overall, we think this is just a good, efficient creature. Sheriff of Safe Passage ended up being a complete flop. The card was just not particularly powerful, even with the ability to plot it on 2. Oftentimes, you're just not able to get this card over what you'd be paying at vanilla rates, and making a truly huge one just doesn't come up except in games that you're super far ahead in, and even then it doesn't have trample. Glyph Elemental looks to be a much more reliable 2-drop. Playing this card early into the game will allow it to scale up, and if you can wait a little bit to bestow while you still have land drops to make, you'll be able to pump up another creature while stacking a big Glyph Elemental underneath it. In either case, I think this card is going to end up being a pretty good rate. It reminds me of Fearless Fledgling, except trading flying for the bestow and for having baseline bear stats, which is much more reasonable if this creature ever gets bounced. For our final change in white, we're cutting the hideouts from the cube, and I will explain that as we get a little later into the cube. I'm going to discuss a major systemic change at that time. So just know that the hideouts are all coming out for one monocolored card. We chose Shepherd of the Clouds. This is a pickup from OTJ that we didn't include the first time around because we were a little questionable about it, whether the mount text on that card was going to be very important. It turns out the card just was a massive overperformer, extremely powerful, and even without the sort of Sun Titan mount effect that it gets, just the value, the flying, the vigilance, all the total package there ended up being just a great rate. All right, so that takes us into blue, where we're going to start with pouring one out for Treasure Cruise. It has been extremely powerful in Is It, which has been one of our best and most nerfed decks throughout the course of this cube. The cards in that deck are just so efficient that a lot of times you're just pressuring your opponent really hard. They're trading resources trying to survive, and then you slam an Ancestral Recall and just the game ends. Brain Surge looks like a cool effect, and it's relatively unique at Arena Peasant because we don't have access to Brainstorm since it hasn't been printed at Common or Uncommon. So, cool card. It will generate value and be able to do some nifty things, we think. So, excited to try this one out. Oracle of Tragedies coming out for Emrakul's Messenger. The Oracle is the kind of card that I personally enjoy having in the cube, but Tim and I both acknowledge that this card has not been the best performer. It's just kind of understated, even if the effects on it are fairly sweet. Emrakul's Messenger looks to be a reasonable, aggressive creature that will be able to provide something a lot of these cards are missing, which is board presence and the ability to help you ramp up into your more powerful spells. We're swapping out Assimilate Essence for Demon Inferior. Demon Inferior has got to be the best version of this effect ever printed. The art's super cool as well, but this card has a couple of upsides going on with it that aren't always apparent at first glance. So because this is a sorcery, you're always going to cast it on your turn, barring shenanigans, which means it will almost always cost a baseline of 3 mana. So if you're able to cast any other draw spells from there, you'll be able to cast it cheaper. Something like play a cantrip and then now play your Demon Inferior for 2 mana means you'll be able to squeeze in a double spell trigger or a prowess trigger, and also just get one of those cards out of your hand to look for more action while you're also contributing to the board with your removal spell. If you play any sort of real card draw spell, a Muldrifter, for example, would let you follow this up for a single mana to kill something. The other big upside that I didn't notice at first on this card is that it puts it second from the top, which means that your opponent does not immediately redraw it, which means that this card ends up being a even bigger tempo hit, and it's going to push your opponent into spots where they feel compelled to put it on the bottom more often, I think. Waterwind Scouts coming out for Spike Bird. Hope Interquaddle looks to be one of the most obnoxious cards from the entire set, and when your blue opponent passes with 3 mana up, you had better player on the tithe. Playing into this is going to be backbreaking in a lot of games. This card is a bit of a watch list card for us just because we're also playing this in our mainline cube where we expect it to be quite good. And if this card ends up being an overperformer even to where we have it kind of mentally checkmarked at, this card could be a card that we have to cut just because it ends up being obnoxious and aggressive. Illyrios has finally taken the plunge and coming out of the cube. And we're going to bring in Hydroelectric Specimen. This is admittedly a very much a test slot card. This card could end up being really, really powerful, but we expect it'll be kind of average where it's either a surprise blocker or it counters a removal spell that was aimed at another creature of yours. It's much worse into green than any of the other colors and much better into red. That being said, in our cube, I do think blue has a bit of a strength against green and a weakness against red. So I think a card that is good in your worst matchup and bad in one of your better matchups is actually an interesting spot to be in. All right, very quick swap. Seagate Oracle is coming out to try out Serum Visionary. I think being a 2/2 means that this card is going to more frequently force a trade with an actual creature. Seagate Oracle obviously has spots where it's better, but Serum Visionary being able to set up future draws as well as having that extra stats, I think makes it a more interesting card. And as Tim pointed out in our Peasant set review, we are getting ever closer to Octopus, which I'm sure will be a 3-mana 3/3 that opts on ETB and will be totally mediocre by that point, I'm sure. In the free space we're getting for our hideout land, we're going to try out Shrieking Drake. This is a pretty old reprint of a Core Skyfisher type effect, and I do think this card is probably a little underpowered. That being said, it has some cool things you can do with it in the cube, and we're going to throw it in there and see if anybody's able to do something really cracked with it. If not, it will probably come out in the next update or sometime during our tinkering that we make between sets. All right, that takes us into black, where we will start off with a very risky change. We're going to swap Lazotep Reaver for Marionette Apprentice. We are very worried about the Apprentice because it does seem like a ridiculously pushed card That being said, we are under the impression that in general, we will try cards out and make them show us that they are too good, at which point we will cut them like we did with stuff like Imminent Recruiter and Soul Herder. So I don't expect this card to be a long-term inclusion in the cube. Since we're going up a Blood Artist effect with the Marionette Apprentice, we're going to go ahead and cut Zulaport Cutthroat for a Cursed Marauder to provide another removal spell that you can work with your Unearth effects and all of those. There's quite a number of those in the cube, so being able to bring back something that contributes to more game plans than just this sort of Blood Artist game plan kind of appeals to us. We think this version of the effect is quite good. We're going to try swapping Disfigure for Consuming Corruption. Disfigure is a strictly anti-aggro card, and Consuming Corruption is a nice little payoff for being heavily invested in playing swamps. If you can get 3 or 4 swamps, this is frequently going to be instant speed, kill a thing, and then gain several life, which is a great place to be for a removal spell. In possibly another contentious change, we're going to try swapping Deadly Dispute for Eviscerator's Insight. Deadly Dispute is an all-timer, and in constructed formats, I believe is the strictly superior card. However, here in Limited, I think there is a much bigger advantage of having cards that have that repeatable value, of that extra grind, rather than generating just a little bit of extra tempo. So the flashback on Eviscerator's Insight means that now this card becomes a game plan instead of just something very powerful as a one-shot spell. This card kind of reads as like, draw 4 cards and sacrifice 2 things, which is across 2 different casts quite powerful. We think this card is going to be very good. Soul Innovation ended up not being nearly as good as I thought it would be, or maybe hoped it would be, because I believe I was a little questionable of it to begin with. But it was usually decent enough, but for 4 mana, you really wanted to get more. You needed a Core Skyfisher effect to really take advantage of this, or something to, a bargain effect or something like that. Fellow Profane will fit right into your mana base and be a removal spell. Here, being a little more inefficient of a removal spell is also totally fine. So we think this will just be kind of occupying similar territory, but have just generally better play patterns within the cube. We're swapping Nightclubber for Grim Servant. Nightclubber can kind of come in and out as we feel like we need stopgap safety valve measures against small tokensy 1/1 decks. Right now, we want to try Grim Servant out, and this card strikes me as a card that can be very, very strong, but will also have some play patterns where it is literally uncastable because of the 3 life being mandatory. I'm actually very surprised they put a penalty or a downside on a card in Modern Magic, but here we are. We'll give this a shot though, because the Demonic Tutor effect is relatively unique for us. No One Left Behind is coming out from Mindless Conscription. As I mentioned, we have a ton of these effects floating around, and we felt like No One Left Behind was one of the weaker ones. Mindless Conscription fits in that same shell of like Core Sky Fishery type stuff, where you can use it to repeatedly cast this Amass Zombies 3. On the other hand, if you're ever able to trigger this via drawing, it is obviously very good. One of the big upsides is with Village Rites and Eviscerators Inside. This kind of pays for itself because you drew a card for turn and then you cast this, draw 2 more cards, and then trigger this again, giving you kind of the free value on that. I'm not sure how good this card will be, but because you get it on ETB, you already are pretty happy with the rate. 3 mana 3/3 isn't incredible, but it's a good enough floor that if you get the upside of being difficult to interact with and being able to trigger again to get you either another zombie or make your 1 zombie gigantic, I think that's a pretty strong upside for a card like this. Forsaken Miner is swapping out for Retrofitted Transmogrant. Forsaken Miner was a little more difficult to trigger when you wanted it than we thought it might be, and ultimately not being able to block was a bit of a downside. The Transmogrant coming in the next set and being a game plan in and of itself kind of striked us as a good time to swap these. The Transmogrant is much more expensive than other versions of this effect, but a 3/3 that is able to block and can repeatedly come back is unprecedented in Peasant, and we feel like it's the kind of card that you can legitimately build your in-game being this card, and that be a reliable game plan against some decks. And with our hideout land in black, we're going to bring in the Shrekmobile. It just should be a good attacking creature and a potentially crazy sack outlet. Each individual trigger of this is not going to be that big of a difference, but this card's pretty quickly going to be attacking for 5, 6, 7 damage. With Menace, oftentimes this is going to be close to unblockable and very, very difficult to deal with a lot of removal. So this card strikes me as the kind of card that will absolutely make certain games revolve around it. So we'll see how it plays. All right, and that takes us into red, where we're going to start with getting rid of Doug's most hated enchantment and convenient target. And we're going to bring in Galvanic Discharge. The Discharge was a card that we kind of didn't expect to get so quickly. We had been considering even stooping down to play the Alchemy Strangle effect to get another cheap removal spell into the cube. But giving us this common is kind of wild. Just to instant speed strangle with multiple levels of upside. So cool. Reckless Lackey ended up kind of sucking, and we're going to replace it with Reckless Pyrosurfer. The Pyrosurfer should support our Naya Spectrum aggressive decks and could also be good in our Rakdos decks that sometimes make a lot of random little bodies. So I think this card is going to fit in a number of decks. And again, here in the Peasant Cube, I think the stat line is much more competitive, where this card's going to frequently just kind of trade for something. Stoke the Flames has not held up in Modern Magic. Turning your creatures sideways and not attacking with them is so often a massive downside. We're going to bring in Ghostfire Slice to replace it. It kind of spots you the first mana for free. And while you can't tap your other creatures to use this, we think it's just a more reliable card. And sometimes your opponent's going to have a multicolor permanent out, like a Invasion of Amonkhet. And it is going to just be a very, very efficient card that can kill them. We're swapping Person of Interest for Molten Gatekeeper. The Person of Interest was kind of a filler spot, and this card played out fine, but wasn't really a necessary or like deck-specific kind of card, just decent little role player. The Gatekeeper strikes us as the kind of card that just kind of barely gets there in terms of all the effects that it's got. A 3-mana 2/3 is a little understated. Molten Impacts without a creature body is not very good, so getting that is pretty nice. And then the Unearth kind of puts this over the top, where later into the game, you'll be able to bring this back to, ping your opponent some more while you play out your creatures, or just to attack for 2 or to sack it or whatever. We think the overall package on this card is a pretty good deal, so we're going to try it out. We're cutting Faithless Looting for Ral and the Implicit Mage. We kind of feel like Faithless Looting just isn't a particularly good limited card. I'm sure there are decks in Vintage Cube and things like that can absolutely break this card in half. But in our Fair Peasant Cube and Mainline Cube, this card just hasn't really performed to the level that we kind of wanted it to. Ral and the Implicit Maze is a card that we could see being a little too slow, but it promises a lot of value. So we're going to give it a shot and see how it plays if maybe a slower red deck is interested in this card. Scapegoat swapping out for the new 1-drop in this set. We don't really expect a lot out of it, but we're going to try it just because none of these 1-drops are particularly important. You just need to have a 1-drop on 1 in some percentage of your games. Spiteful Prankster's getting swapped for Skittering Precursor. The Prankster has just been a completely obnoxious and unreasonable card that often just kills you out of nowhere from relatively safe life totals, and when paired with any number of Blood Artist effects, just goes absolutely wild. Skittering Precursor should also fit into the sort of Rakdos sack decks, while also just being a reasonable enough stat line that if you have any synergy for this card, you're probably playing it. And even if you don't, you might play a 3/3 Menace if you have some ways to pump it. And that takes us to Fire Prophecy getting swapped for Skoa Embermage. We're going to give Skoa a shot. We haven't really wanted a red 6-drop, but Skoa does probably kill something on ETB and then force a trade with another creature. So it kind of feels like a red Fairs Band Brawler, and Fairs Band Brawler is a pretty decent card. Please ignore the Granger text on this card. You don't get extra copies when you draft it. And for our Hideout land slot, we're going to swap it for Pinnacle Monk. We are very excited for Pinnacle Monk. Shipwreck Dowser has been an incredible card in the cube. It's been a mainstay since day one, and Pinnacle Monk is just another in that vein. It also pairs really well with your reanimation effects, just like the Shipwreck Dowser does, so you'll be able to assemble those combos more frequently. And then finally, we're going to swap Take for a Ride back for Twisted Fealty. Take for a Ride promised a dream of being able to cast this during your opponent's combat step and like take control of their creature and do the thing and blow them out in combat. That literally never came up for any of us the entire time OTJ was around. So we're just going to replace it for the card that provides a pretty substantial upside in addition to the steal effect. All right, and that takes us into green, where we are going to start with a swap of Rambling Possum for Eldrazi Repurposer. We considered making Jewel Thief the swap here, but we're not quite ready to let go of that card, and we think some people might have rioted over it. The Possum is a decent enough little creature, but we have a million of these effects floating around, and it's oftentimes difficult for the Possum to actually attack, because your green decks are so frequently defensive. The Repurposer should just be a really solid 3-drop and will threaten to accelerate into bigger creatures and can aggressively trade if your opponent decides to attack. Real quick, hard-hitting questions getting swapped for Horrific Assault. Some percentage of the time you'll be able to gain 3 life, but mostly we just like the art. Horrific Assault has some sick art, and hard-hitting question had very mediocre art. Aftermath Analyst is coming out for Propagator Drone. The Analyst was a cool card, but the thing is that some percentage of the time this card just mills with either itself or with a little extra help, mills into 3 or 4 lands and just kind of pops off. And sometimes you've milled 6 cards and you've seen 1 land and it's not really worth it to activate. We don't really like the range of game-breaking to useless play patterns that this card has on top of the mediocre stats. So we're going to swap it for Propagator Drone. This card is very narrow, admittedly, but because it triggers when it comes into play, it will be able to pump all your 1/1 tokens creatures into 2/2s, which is quite powerful, we feel like, for a 2-mana play, and even has a mana sink should you be flooding and not having anything to cast. We're going to swap Shadow Beast Sighting for Territory Color. The color is one that we're not sure is even good, which is kind of wild with power creep, because a 7/5 for 5 is what would have in most sets been massive. And while it is very, very big, it doesn't have any form of protection or ETB effect. And so if you don't have a land drop to immediately make, which would make this functionally a 6-drop, this card has got to survive an entire turn without being interacted with, which is kind of unlikely in Modern Magic. Shadow Beast Sighting is a fine enough card, but we have other cards that fill a similar role, so we're going to let this one go for now and see how things play out. Up the Beanstalk is finally hitting the bin for Bridgework Battles. Up the Beanstalk has just been an absolutely incredible value engine. One of the strongest cards in the cube. It's banned in multiple formats, and we feel like we're finally reaching a point where we're just kind of tired of what this card is doing. Bridgework Battles is a fine card. Be a decent fight spell. It's a modal land. What's not to like? All right, Beanstalk Giant is finally hitting the curb for Disciple of Frailties. Beanstalk Giant was a fine enough card. That being said, as time has gone on, the cube's gotten faster. This card's lack of any sort of combat keywords on the creature side is kind of becoming noticeable. Disciple of Frailties, we're not sure if it's actually going to be good, but it was a really cool card, so we wanted to go ahead and test it and see how it plays. Colony Garden is coming out for Evolution Witness. The Witness is one of the most exciting prints that we've seen in a long time. This card looks absolutely ridiculous and will range from just good value card to completely takes over a game, depending on how you're able to build around it. And then Cabaret Courtyard, or the hideout land in this color, is coming out for Malevolent Rumble. The Rumble, we think, is just going to be an excellent card. We support graveyard synergies in this cube, but even if you're not particularly graveyard oriented, it's still a ramp spell or a 1-mana cantrip that looks at a very large number of cards. So we think this will find home in multiple decks, but will probably be prioritized by the green-black decks, where this card will be excellent. All right, that takes us into multicolor. Starting out with Callous Sellsword for Poetic Rebirth. The Sellsword is a totally fine card. It's done an okay job in the cube, but Poetic Rebirth looked super cool, so it's a card that we really wanted to test out. We love these sort of 2-for-1 value cards. especially when they require a little bit of work to get your value. So sometimes this card's going to be, completely useless, obviously. Most often, you're going to probably pick up like a 2 or a 3 drop, shock or bolt something, kill it, and then have another 3 drop to cast. But later into the game, this card gets much more powerful. The longer you can hold this card, the better it's going to be. And it obviously is super sick if you have Slick Shot Lockpicker. We're going to try swapping Ash Party Crasher for Conduit Goblin. We're really not sure which of these 2 cards is better, but we're just going to try out the new card. The Conduit Goblin is a little worse the turn you play it without having haste, but being able to haste out a 3 drop on turn 3, I think is going to be better than Ash on average. I could be wrong, but Tim and I both kind of think this Conduit Goblin being a bit of a 2-mana Furnace Strider type card is going to have some extremely explosive lines available to it, which will help out our Boros aggressive decks. Vohar, Vidalian Desecrator, is coming out for Sneaky Snacker. Try saying that 5 times fast. Sneaky Snacker is not the kind of card that currently has a home. It doesn't really fit into our decks, despite having good creature types. And we're not really sure if it's going to do anything, but Vohar's been here a while, so we just decided to try this card out and see if it enables anything new. One of the more powerful things you can do with it, or more obvious synergy pieces at least, is using a Village Rites or Eviscerator's Insight type card to sack this card and pay for it by itself in the same way that Mindless Conscription did. Because we got Shadow Beast Hiding, we decided to also cut Root Coil Creeper so that we don't accidentally signal a flashback synergy or a flashback theme. You can, and I have done this card with Rise from the Ants, which is a good enough reason to include it in your deck. But we think Planar Genesis will function pretty well as a card that will ramp in the early game and then provide really good card selection in the late game to help us find our threats. So we think that's just an overall more valuable use of the slot, even if Planar Genesis is a little boring. And our last multicolor swap is Breakout for Writhing Chrysalis. And we think the Breakout didn't really perform as well as we wanted it to. Writhing Chrysalis looks to be a forever type card. Like, this is such a powerful card. It provides value in multiple ways and just in general be an extremely powerful card. And that's before you add any extra synergies into it. All right, real quick, we're going to do our colorless cards. Gravestone Strider's coming out for Solar Transformer. We cut Cold Steel Heart a ways back, but the Transformer has a little bit of extra upside to it, being able to fix for a multiple number of different colors over the course of a game. So we like that. Gravestone Strider was pretty fillery, didn't really do a ton. It was sweet in MKM, but did not make the jump into Peasant Cube. As much as I like Monoscallion, it isn't popular and isn't honestly all that powerful. Mobile Homestead is a card that played really well in OTJ, so we're going to go ahead and give it a shot here. It's not going to have haste very often here since we don't have very many mounts, but we do still feel like it's like a totally passable 2-drop that you could pick up if you are desperate for one, which is a good use of a colorless slot. All right, and that takes us into our lands, which we'll quickly mention that we're swapping Prismatic Vista for Conduit Pylons. So with our lands, we are making a concentrated effort to start downgrading the lands into peasant playable lands to make this a true Peasant Cube. We've noticed the mana has just been a little too good lately, and we like that by making the lands not rare, we'll be able to make our Peasant Cube more accessible to even more drafters. Most people have the lands that we play, but not everyone does. And sometimes people have felt a little misled when they were expected to craft rare lands in our cube. Conduit Pylons was a total banger in OTJ, and we do currently run Dance of the Tumbleweed, so while that's around, you could assemble that combo as a way of building your own Surveil land. All right, big picture changes. I could not find a picture that had all 10 pathways, so in your mind's eye or whatever, just pretend that this is all 10 pathways coming out for all 10 of the landscape lands coming in, which is what led us to get rid of the hideout lands. The landscapes kind of fit that same spot, but will cover all 10 3-color pairs. If you're able to fix your mana really well, you even get a little bit of extra value. This is the kind of land that we were looking for to replace our rare lands with. These don't feel like they are just bad lands. They feel like they are power level appropriate fixing for a peasant format without being as good as rare lands. Okay, so in what's likely a fairly controversial change, we're going to swap the check lands out for the MDFCs from this set. This was another good set of lands that will let us decrease the rarity of the mana base and to make this more into a true Peasant Cube. We're still going to be running a couple of cycles of rare lands, but as we get more lands like this, we'll look to exchange those out as well. The MDFCs being spells of hybrid mana means many of them will be cards that are contested, particularly ones like Stump Stomp, Legion Leadership, Revitalizing Repast. I could see all of those being contested by multiple decks. So if you see these cards and you're in one or both of the colors, you might want to strongly consider taking these. Okay, so that was a ton of cards to go through. I tried to keep the pace up, so hopefully I'll be able to keep this video from being an hour-long set update. In any case, thank you for joining us, and I'm just going to go ahead and post the Jank Diver Gaming schedule here. So as usual, on Wednesday at 7:30 EST and Sunday at 7:30 EST, we play our mainline cube. We play this Peasant Cube on Saturdays at 7:30 EST. And then we have our Saturday, Sunday early cubes at 2:30 EST and our Friday 7:30 PM EST community vote cube. Because summer just hit, we are running a little low on players. So if you're someone who hasn't come out to draft with us and are interested in that, now would be a good time to start coming in and helping these drafts fire and really getting involved in the community. And we would greatly appreciate it. If you want to find more content, you can find us at youtube.com/@JankDiverGaming. You can find me streaming our cubes at twitch.tv/TeldTalks. And you can find me, Tim, and Chris talking about our thoughts on Magic, mostly in the space of Cube, but some big picture thoughts over at the Jank Tank on Libsyn, YouTube, and Spotify. Thanks again for joining me and have a great day.